Welcome back to Learn PHP on Code Academy. We're in the Introduction to PHP Functions section. This is variable scope. Passing arguments into a function and returning values is a clear way to define the interface between the function and the rest of the code. This is a preferred method of exchanging information within a program since it is straightforward to see the data a function depends on from the function parameter list. Consider the following function. It returns a number of days left to feed depending on the number of chickens and the rate at which they consume it. Here we have function calculate days left. It takes in feed quantity, number, and rate. It then will create this result variable and assign to it feed quantity divided by number times rate. It then will return result. We then echo and invoke calculate days left and pass in 300 for feed quantity, 2 for number, and 30 for rate. You can immediately see that this function depends on three pieces of information to provide an answer: feed quantity, number, and rate. We also echo what is returned by the function instead of a variable from inside the function. If we attempted to echo result outside of the function, it would throw an error, undefined variable. This is due to variable scope. Each function has its own local scope. This means that any variables defined within the function's code block can only be accessed within the code block itself. However, if many functions depend on the same piece of information, it can be beneficial to have a variable that can be accessed anywhere without being passed in. To do this, we have to use the global keyword to tell PHP to look in the global scope for the variable instead of the local scope of the function. Here we have feed quantity is assigned 300. We have our function calculate days left, which takes in a number and a rate. We then say global feed quantity, and that will refer to this global variable feed quantity. And then we have our result variable made, and it's assigned feed quantity divided by number times rate. We then return result, and here we echo calculate days left with only 2 and 120 passed in, since feed quantity is now a global variable which we have access to within our function. When using this pattern, it becomes slightly more difficult to determine what information this function depends on. Make sure to consider this trade-off when implementing your own functions. Note that the global keyword is not used when invoking functions. Once a function has been defined, it can be used within the same code block or even within other function code blocks. This code will print this works to the console. Here we have function first. Will echo this works when invoked. Here we have function second, which invokes our first function. And then out here we invoke the second function, which will run the first function, which will echo this works. Our instructions say we've created a function that will create a formatted name for a coding lesson based on two arguments: language, the name of the programming language being taught, and concept, the name of the concept being taught. We want to restructure the code to use the global language instead of having to pass it in every time. Remove language from the parameter list and rewrite the function to use the global language instead. Be sure to update the invocation of generate lesson name to use only a single parameter. Let's do that now. Let's run it. And we do pass, and we were able to access our global language variable. So what we're learning here about variable scope. So depending where a variable is declared will decide the scope of where that variable can be accessed. If we want to be able to access a global variable within our function, we are able to do that using the global keyword. As it says down here, each function has its own local scope. This means that variables defined within that function can only be accessed within the code block itself. But if many functions depend on the same piece of information, it can be beneficial to us to have a variable that can be accessed anywhere without being passed in, and that's when we would use the global keyword. We were able to restructure our code to do this. So whenever you create your own programs, consider the benefits or costs that may come included with using the global keyword. But as long as you understand that we use the global keyword to be able to access a variable we have in our global scope. As long as you're understanding that, you're getting this lesson, and I'll see you in the next one.